before the iron was forged into a throne, before the 7 kingdoms were even a fevered dream in the minds of conquerors. There was an empire forged in the crucible of volcanoes. They say that history is written by the victors, but the truest history is written in ash. It is written in the silence that follows the scream, in the shadows burned onto stone walls by a light brighter than the sun. We look at the ruins of the world and we see tragedy, but if we listen closely to the wind that howls through the broken arches, we hear a song of a city where the towers kissed the heavens, sculpted not by the chisel of man, but by the breath of beasts and the twisting of magic. Valyria, a name that even now, thousands of years later, is whispered with a mixture of reverence and primal terror. It was the homeland of the Dragonlords, men and women with hair like spun silver and eyes like amethyst, who rode the winged nightmares as if they were extensions of their own souls. They built a civilization that brought the world to its knees, with swords that never dulled and a sorcery that made them believe they were more gods than mortals. But there is an ancient truth older than stone, older than fire. The higher you fly, the farther you have to fall. Tonight, we do not tell the story of a conquest. We tell the story of a loss. The story of how the greatest empire the world has ever known vanished in a single night of fire and shadow. So, settle into the darkness. Listen to the crackle of the imaginary hearth. For the story of Valyria is a lullaby about power, arrogance, and inevitable ruin. Sweet dreams, and may they not be consumed by the flames. Hello, I'm Max. I am very glad you have chosen to join me tonight. I know that out there, in the waking world, the noise can be deafening. Demands on your time, the rush of the days, the weight of responsibilities, it all accumulates, doesn't it? But here, right now, none of that exists. This space we are creating together is a sanctuary. It is a place where the clock stops ticking, where the to-do lists dissolve into mist, and where the only thing that matters is the sound of my voice and the story we are about to unravel. Tonight, we are going to undertake a journey. It is a long journey, spanning thousands of years and crossing oceans of time. We are going to explore the rise and the catastrophic fall of Valyria. This is not just a history lesson. It is an immersion into a lost age. We will walk the roads of fused dragonstone. We will feel the heat of the 14 flames, and we will witness the hubris of those who thought they could tame the earth itself. But before we step into that ancient heat, I want you to take a moment for yourself. Find a position that allows your body to completely let go. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Feel the support of the surface beneath you, holding you up so you don't have to hold yourself. Take a deep breath in, filling your lungs with cool, calming air, and exhale slowly, letting the tension flow out like smoke. Again, in and out. If you drift off to sleep at any point during this tale, that is perfectly fine. That is what we are here for. Let the lore be the vessel that carries you into your dreams. Now, let us turn the hourglass over. Let us cross the narrow sea of memory. Let us go to the beginning. Our chronicle does not begin with the glitter of gold or the polish of marble halls. It begins in a place much older, much wilder. It begins on a peninsula of harsh, unforgiving earth, sculpted by fire and lashed by the salt winds of the sea. A place the world seemed to have forgotten or perhaps feared to remember, the Valyrian Peninsula. In this land of austere and dangerous beauty, beneath a sky frequently veiled by volcanic smog, lived a humble people, the Proto-Valyrians. Long before their names were whispered with fear in every corner of the known map, they were simply shepherds. Their existence was a cycle of simplicity and endurance, a life dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, by the seasons of rain and drought. They guided their flocks of thick-wooled sheep and goats across rocky hills and plains covered in tough, scorched grass, finding sustenance in a land that offered little more than stones and wind. For these people, the world was the smell of damp earth after a storm, the bleating of a newborn lamb, and the warmth of a modest campfire at the end of a long, exhausting day. Their culture was oral. their legends told in simple songs, their worries focused on the wolf that prowled in the darkness or the storm gathering on the horizon. They were a people of the earth, grounded and small, but their horizon was unlike any other in the world. It was dominated by a vision of primordial power and terror, a constant presence that shaped their psychology and their spirituality. A chain of mountains that did not sleep. Volcanoes, the 14 flames, as they would come to be known. They were open wounds in the crust of the world, scars of a violent creation. Mountains that breathed fire and smoke, whose bowels burned with a heat that came from the very heart of the planet. Rivers of incandescent lava flowed down their slopes in a slow, relentless flux, redrawing the maps of the landscape with every eruption. The air was heavy with the stench of sulfur and brimstone. To most peoples, this would be a cursed land, a hell on earth to be avoided at all costs. But for the Valyrians, it was home. And they were not alone. For within those living mountains, in caverns heated by eternal fire and on peaks shrouded in steam, dwelt the creatures most magnificent and terrifying that ever flew the skies. Dragons. These were not the docile beasts of later tapestries or the wise conversationalists of elven legends. These were forces of nature incarnate, animals of a savage intelligence and an unimaginable power. Their bodies were fortresses of scales, harder than steel and shimmering like jewels in tones of obsidian, bronze, gold, and jade. Their wings, vast as the sails of a great ship, could create hurricanes with a single beat, a sound that echoed through the mountains like thunder. And their breath, it was the very essence of fire, a torrent of destruction capable of melting stone and transforming forests into deserts of ash. They nested in the volcanic calderas, using the earth's heat to incubate their stone eggs. They hunted on the plains and in the seas, and their presence was a constant threat to the Valyrian shepherds. For countless generations, the people lived in the shadow of the dragons. They viewed them as cruel gods or demons of the fire. They built their shelters far from the slopes in protected valleys. They offered sacrifices of their best livestock in hopes of appeasing their fury, and they told bedtime stories to their children about never venturing too close to the smoking mountains. Fear was the bedrock of their existence, a reverence born not of love, but of absolute terror. But at some moment lost to history, fear began to transform into something else. Curiosity, observation, and finally, an ambition that bordered on insanity. The legends say it was the shepherds themselves who took the first step. Accustomed to watching their flocks for days on end, they applied the same patience to the winged beasts. They began to study the dragons not as gods, but as animals. They learned to predict their hunting patterns, to recognize the different types of roars, to understand the hierarchy within their clutches. They saw that, despite all their power, the dragons also had vulnerabilities. They bled, they slept, and sometimes they fought each other. A new idea began to form in the minds of those humble men and women. What if the fire didn't need to be only feared? What if it could be commanded? What if the relationship between man and dragon didn't have to be predator and prey, but master and servant? It was a transition that did not happen overnight. It was a slow, dangerous process that certainly cost the lives of many audacious souls. They tried with force and failed. They tried with traps and failed, until they discovered the true secret, a secret that lay not in steel or stone, but in their own lineage. They discovered the magic that ran in their blood, an ancient, dormant affinity with the fire and the creatures born of it. Through rituals of blood, chants long forgotten, and a willpower that bordered on the divine, they learned to forge a psychic bond with the beasts. They did not tame the dragons with chains, but with the mind. They did not break them with whips, but bound them with sorcery. The lore suggests that this magic was likely taught to them, or stolen by them, from a forgotten people who came before, or perhaps discovered in the deep, dark places beneath the volcanoes where the fireworms dwelt. Regardless of the source, the result was the same, the bond. The first Valyrian to successfully mount a dragon and fly the skies was not a king or a general. He was a shepherd, and on that day the destiny of his people, and of the entire world, changed forever. The humble shepherds were on the path to becoming the Dragonlords, and from their volcanic lands, they prepared to build an empire that would make the world tremble. The echo of that first flight resonated not just in the skies, but in the very souls of the Valyrian people. The sight of one of their own, riding the storm of fire they had so feared, was a revelation that broke the chains of fear forever. The terrified reverence they felt for the beasts transformed into a feverish greed. Power was no longer something to be avoided. It was a birthright to be claimed. The era of the shepherds had ended. The era of the Dragonlords was just beginning. The art of taming the beasts became the central obsession of their culture, a sacred science that mixed the courage of exploration with the darkness of sorcery. They delved into the secrets of their own bloodlines, discovering an ancient resonance, a silent song that only they could hear, and that the dragons, somehow, answered. They called this blood magic. It was not the magic of parlor tricks or light shows. It was primordial, visceral, and dangerous. It demanded sacrifice. The early rituals were acts of desperation and intuition. They offered their own blood to the beasts, not as a tribute of submission, but as an invitation, a bridge between two natures. They discovered that the blood of certain lineages was more potent, more pure, resonating more strongly with the fire of the dragons. These families, whose ancestors may have been the first to dare approach the 14 flames, rose naturally as the elite of their new and rigid society. There were 40 noble houses, the Dragonlords, and the right to ride a dragon became the definitive mark of status. To maintain this purity, they adopted the custom of marrying brother to sister, cousin to cousin, believing this strengthened the song of fire in their blood and prevented their gift from being diluted among the lesser peoples. The bond between a lord and his dragon was a marvel and a terror. It was a fusion of minds that transcended mortal comprehension. The rider could feel the savage hunger of his mount, the fury that burned in its magma heart, and the indomitable joy of gliding above the clouds. In their dreams, they shared visions, flying over unknown lands. But the bond was also a double-edged sword. If the rider felt fear, the dragon could become hesitant. If the rider was consumed by rage, the dragon could become a force of uncontrollable destruction. And the death of one was a wound the other would carry forever. When a dragon died, its rider felt a part of their soul extinguished. And when a rider fell, their dragon sometimes refused to accept any other master, becoming a wild, embittered creature until the end of its days. With this new weapon at their disposal, Valyrian society transformed. They used the breath of their dragons to revolutionize their civilization. Fire, controlled with magical precision, became their primary tool. They melted the rock of the mountains, fusing it into a black, smooth material, without joints or flaws, stronger than any granite. With this dragonstone, they raised their cities, no longer humble shelters, but fortresses and monuments to their own grandeur, with towers that spiraled in impossible geometries. Their arrogance grew with every new conquest, with every new demonstration of their power. They no longer saw other peoples of the world as equals, but as primitive beings, crawling in the dust while they danced with the stars. And it was with this mentality that they looked to the east, to the greatest empire the world knew, not as a neighbor to be respected, but as an obstacle to be removed, an ancient culture to be erased to make way for the new and glorious era of Valyria. Before Valyria and its dragons became the undisputed masters of the known world, another power, older and of a different order, dominated the lands to the east. An empire built not on fire, but on brick, discipline, and the chains of slavery. This was the old empire of Guise. Its symbol, the harpy, a creature with the body of a woman, wings of a bat, and talons of an eagle, perfectly represented its nature. A mixture of civilization and predatory cruelty. Founded by Grasdan the Great in a time so remote it was lost in the mists of legend, the Giscari Empire was one of the first and most powerful civilizations to emerge after the Long Night. Its cities, like Great Guise, Astapor, Yunkai, and Myrene, were monuments of brick, with immense stepped pyramids rising toward a copper sky, challenging time itself. The power of Guise did not reside in arcane magic or winged beasts. but in something they had perfected to a nearly superhuman level: military organization. The legions of guys were the most feared fighting force of their era. They were composed of slave soldiers, men who fought not for loyalty or glory, but out of a discipline forged in fear and the most brutal training imaginable. From infancy, they were taught not to feel pain, not to have an identity, to be merely a cog in a vast and implacable war machine. They marched in perfect phalanx formation, a wall of tall bronze shields and long spears, moving as a single organism, a river of iron and obedience that crushed all tribal armies and lesser kingdoms that dared oppose them. Their reputation preceded them. It was said a Giscari legion never broke formation, even in the face of certain death. This military might allowed guys to build a vast empire, centered around the bay that would one day be known as Slavers' Bay. Their economy, their culture, their very existence was fueled by an inexhaustible source: slavery. They conquered peoples, chained them, and forced them to work in their fields, to build their pyramids, and, most importantly, to fight in their legions. Giscari society was a rigid pyramid, with the wise masters at the top, enjoying decadent luxury, and a massive base of slaves whose lives held no value. They saw themselves as the masters of the world, a superior civilization destined to rule over the lesser, barbarian peoples. When the first whispers about the Dragonlords of Valyria reached the east, the masters of guys dismissed them with contempt. To them, the Valyrians were merely a primitive people of shepherds who had been lucky enough to stumble upon some flying lizards. They could not imagine that those pets could represent a real threat to their perfectly disciplined legions, which had conquered the known world for 5,000 years. Giscari arrogance, born of millennia of uncontested rule, blinded them to the nature of the new force rising in the west. The rivalry between the two nascent empires was inevitable. Their borders began to touch, their trade routes to cross. Disputes over territory and resources became increasingly frequent. Valyria, with its new and explosive expansion, and Guise, with its ancient and entrenched power, were on a collision course. The world was not big enough for two titans. The Harpy and the Dragon were about to enter a dance of death, a series of conflicts that would decide which form of power, the cold discipline of man or the primordial fire of nature, would reign supreme over the era to come. The collision between the two greatest empires of the world was not a single battle, but a long and bloody saga that stretched for generations. History would call it the Five Wars, a series of conflicts that tested the limits of human discipline against the primordial fury of the skies. The first war began not with a formal declaration, but with a skirmish on a disputed border, a colony city claimed by both empires. The Giscari Empire, confident in its military superiority, sent its legions to crush what they considered a small Valyrian insurgency. They expected a quick and decisive victory, a show of force that would put the shepherds with lizards in their place. The legions marched in their impeccable formation, a wall of bronze shields and long spears, a sight that had broken the will of entire nations. And, at first, their tactic worked. The Valyrian infantry, less disciplined and outnumbered, retreated before the relentless march of the Giscari soldiers. The Giscari commanders smiled. Victory seemed, as always, inevitable. And then they heard the sound, a sound that was not of trumpets or war drums. It was a sound like a hurricane being born, the beating of colossal wings tearing the air. From the sky, the dragons descended. The first appearance of dragons on an organized battlefield was a shock that transcended the war itself. The legionnaires of Guise, trained to face any infantry formation or cavalry charge, had no answer for an enemy attacking from above, with a fire that melted the bronze of their shields and cooked men inside their own armor. The concept of discipline, the basis of all their military might, crumbled before such absolute terror. Horses went mad, men threw down their spears and fled in panic, and the perfect formation disintegrated into a chaos of screams and burning flesh. Valyria won the first war, not by the strength of its armies, but by the overwhelming power of its beasts. But the Giscari Empire was vast and resilient. They retreated, regrouped, and learned. In the Second War, they came prepared. They built giant scorpions, ballistae capable of firing spears the size of small trees, in hopes of bringing down the dragons from the sky. They covered their shields with wet sand to try to resist the fire. But it was useless. The dragons were too fast, flew too high, and their fire was too hot. Again, the legions were broken, and another Giscari city was reduced to ashes. The Third and Fourth Wars followed a similar and desperate pattern. In each conflict, Guise sent even larger armies, recruiting more and more slaves from its provinces, throwing waves of men against the flames. And in each conflict, Valyria responded with more dragons. The 40 families of Dragonlords, formerly rivals, united against the common enemy. The sky over the battlefields filled with dozens of dragons of all colors and sizes. A glorious sight for the Valyrians and an apocalyptic nightmare for their enemies. The wars left deep scars on the land, creating vast deserts of black glass where dragonfire had touched the sand. Giscari arrogance transformed into bitter stubbornness, a refusal to accept that their time as masters of the world had come to an end. They fought no longer for victory, but for the very survival of their identity. Each defeat only fed their hatred, and they prepared for a final and desperate confrontation. They gathered all their remaining legions, every man and boy capable of holding a spear, and marched for the final battle, an all-or-nothing gamble to preserve their millennial empire. The final battle was fought on the outskirts of the capital itself, the great city of Giscari. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and the sound of 100,000 men preparing to die. The wise masters of Guise, standing atop their immense pyramid, watched their last and greatest army form on the plains. They had bet everything on this single battle. It was the discipline of millennia against the blood magic of a new era. This time, the Valyrians did not send just a few dragons. They came in their full force. The sky darkened with the beating of hundreds of wings. Valyrian, the Black Dread's ancestor, led the charge, his shadow alone capable of swallowing entire battalions. What followed was not a battle, but an extermination. Dragonfire rained down upon the legions of Guise for hours, a storm of annihilation that offered no truce nor hope of escape. The greatest army the world had ever seen was reduced to a field of ash and charred bones. But the fury of the Valyrians did not end on the battlefield. They sought not just victory, they sought the total eradication of their rival. With the army destroyed, the dragons turned against the city of Giscari. The fire that had melted bronze shields now melted the brick walls of the Great Pyramids. Tower after tower, temple after temple, everything was consumed by the flames. The great capital of the Giscari Empire, a city that had resisted for 5,000 years, was completely destroyed in a single day. And, to ensure that nothing would ever grow there again, the Valyrians covered the smoking ruins with salt, sulfur, and the skulls of their enemies. Total annihilation, a display of power so absolute it would serve as a warning to the rest of the world for all eternity. The old empire of Guise ceased to exist. With the fall of its central power, the colony cities of Guise in Slavers Bay, Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen quickly surrendered. But the Valyrians did not annex them directly into their empire. They left them as independent city-states, broken but functional, whose principal industry would become the slave trade which now flourished in the power vacuum. The Valyrians became their main clients, buying workforce to labor in their own deadly mines. The legacy of Guise, ironically, was preserved in the form of the very institution that sustained it, slavery. The harpy was toppled, and the dragon now reigned supreme, uncontested. The victory over Guise marked the true beginning of the Valyrian Freehold as the greatest power in the world. They had proven there was no army, no fortress, no empire that could resist the power of blood and fire. They were the lords of the world, and their long and glorious era of dominion was just beginning, built upon the ashes of their first and greatest enemy. With their enemies reduced to ash and salt, the Valyrian Freehold blossomed, becoming the center of the known world. And at the heart of its vast empire lay the city of Valyria itself, a metropolis that defied imagination and the very logic of mortal engineering. It was not a built city, but a sculpted one, dreamed and brought into existence by fire and magic. The light there was different. During the day, the sun struggled to penetrate the perpetual smog rising from the 14 flames, creating a golden and ethereal twilight where everything seemed to shine with an inner light. At night, the city did not plunge into darkness. It was illuminated by magical lanterns that burned without fuel, by crystals that pulsed with starlight, and by the constant red glow of lava rivers winding in the distance down the mountain slopes. The air was always warm, charged with the smell of ozone, metal, and ancient, powerful magic. The dominant sound was not of carts or crowds, but the low, constant hum of complex spells and, above all, the occasional and overwhelming sound of leathery wings beating in the sky. The architecture of Valyria was a miracle and an anomaly. Its towers, famous in all legends, were not made of stacked stone blocks. They rose toward the sky in continuous spirals, as if the rock itself had been melted and molded like wax by the will of the Dragonlords. There were no joints, no mortar, only a smooth, black surface of dragonstone, polished until it shone like obsidian. Some towers were so high their peaks were lost in the clouds of smoke, and it was said the largest dragons made their nests there, looking down on the world as if they were kings on stone thrones. The streets, likewise, were not paved but fused. They were rivers of smooth black rock, so perfect they reflected the magical light of the city like a dark mirror. Walking on them was like walking on a solidified night sky, and guarding the grand avenues and palaces of the noble families were the sphinxes, massive stone creatures with bodies of dragons and the beautiful, arrogant faces of Valyrian men and women, their jeweled eyes seeming to follow anyone who passed, a constant reminder of who the masters of that place were. In the sky, dragons were a common sight. They were the traffic of the city, the living symbol of its power. Valyrian children did not grow up watching birds, but the silhouettes of dragons of all colors, bronze, green, silver, black, flying gracefully between the impossible towers. Their roars were the call to dinner, their shadows a fleeting cover against the eternal glow of the city. They were not just beasts or weapons. They were part of the family, part of the identity of each noble house. The sight of a Dragonlord descending from the heavens on his mount was a spectacle of power and beauty that would leave any foreigner on their knees, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and admiration. The city pulsed with an energy that was at once magnificent and oppressive. It was a place of almost painful beauty, but a beauty built on a foundation of invisible suffering. For behind the gleaming towers and the silver-haired nobles, there was a city of shadows, a city of slaves. Thousands of them, brought from conquered lands, performed all the mundane work. They cleaned the dragonstone streets, cooked the banquets, tended the gardens, and, most importantly, died by the thousands in the volcanic mines, extracting the ores and jewels that fed the luxury of their masters. They were the silent and disposable gear in the great machine of Valyria, and their presence was a constant reminder that the splendor of the city was paid for with the price of the liberty of countless souls. It was a civilization of extremes, of divine beauty and abyssal cruelty, a marvel built on the edge of hell. The power in Valyria did not rest in the hands of a single king or emperor. The Valyrian Freehold was an oligarchy, an aristocratic republic governed by a council of the 40 most powerful families. These were the Dragonlords, the only bloodlines pure enough to tame and ride the great beasts. The power of a family was measured not just by their lands or their wealth in gold, but by the number and strength of the dragons they commanded. A house with 5 dragons was vastly more influential than a house with only 2, and a house whose dragon was old and large, like the legendary Balerion, was feared and respected above all others. This power structure created an atmosphere of constant and relentless rivalry. The 40 families were not allies, but competitors in a perpetual game of power. Their politics were a complex web of alliances forged through strategic marriages, secret pacts sealed with blood magic, and silent betrayals executed with poison or spells. Life in the Valyrian elite was a dangerous dance, where one false step could mean the ruin of an entire house. In this great game, House Targaryen was not one of the principal players. They were one of the 40 families, yes, noble and of pure blood, with the right to ride dragons. But they were far from being the richest or most powerful. They were considered a minor house, perhaps a bit eccentric, with an inclination for mystical and prophetic arts that the more pragmatic and martial families viewed with a certain disdain. While the great houses like the Bellarese or the Coheres disputed control of the richest mines and most lucrative colonies, the Targaryens seemed more interested in their ancient books and their dreams. This relatively modest position in the hierarchy of power would be, ironically, the key to their survival. When Daenys the Dreamer had her vision of the doom, her father, Enar, was able to act because his house was not so deeply rooted in the power structures of Valyria. Abandoning the capital was a great sacrifice, but it was not like abandoning the center of the universe, as it would be for the most powerful families. They could afford to leave. The life of the Dragonlords was one of luxury and decadence that the rest of the world could barely conceive. They lived in palaces that were works of magical art, with hanging gardens and fountains that sang. They dressed in silks and velvets woven with gold and silver threads, adorned with jewels extracted from the depths of the earth by their slaves. They ate delicacies brought from the farthest corners of their empire and drank wines that glowed with their own light. They saw themselves as a species apart, closer to gods than to the common men they ruled. They believed their dragon blood made them immune to the weaknesses and moralities of lesser peoples. This arrogance was the base of their culture. They were the masters of the world, and the world existed to serve them. Their power seemed eternal, their city impregnable, and their dominion absolute. They never considered, not for a moment, that their civilization, like the towers they built, could one day collapse and turn to dust and memory. They had conquered the world, but they had forgotten to fear the fire that gave them power in the first place. The glory of Valyria was a song sung in obsidian towers and mirrored stone streets. It was a symphony of power, magic, and beauty. But every great song has silent notes, dark harmonies that sustain the melody. And beneath the stunning beauty of the Valyrian capital, in the very bowels of the earth that gave it power, existed a particular hell, an engine of suffering that fed every facet of its splendor. These were the mines, the burning heart of the peninsula and the source of all its wealth. The same 14 flames that served as nests for the dragons also bled gold, silver, and a rainbow of precious stones. But this wealth was not offered freely. It was ripped from the rock with an unimaginable human cost, a price paid with the lives and souls of hundreds of thousands of slaves. The mines of Valyria were a destination of no return. When Valyrian armies conquered a city, the survivors were not merely subjugated. They were harvested. Men, women, and children were chained and boarded onto great ships, whose dark holds were only a preview of the horror that awaited them. Upon arriving at the peninsula, they were forced on a march to the smoking mouths of the mines, a portal to a world without sun and without hope. The heat inside was a physical force, an oppressive wall that stole the air from lungs and made sweat evaporate the instant it touched skin. The air was thick with volcanic smoke, metal dust, and the acrid smell of fear, a slow poison that corroded body and mind. Although Valyrian sorcerers used their magic to open the main tunnels, the arduous and dangerous work of extracting the ore was left to the bare hands and broken backs of the captives. Life, or the slow march to death, in these depths was an endless nightmare, an ocean of lost souls, stripped of their names, their cultures, and their humanity, reduced to mere instruments of labor. Kings who once wore golden crowns now broke rocks beside the farmers they once ruled. Priests of forgotten gods prayed in silence while carrying baskets of heavy ore, their prayers muffled by the constant sound of pickaxes and the echo of distant screams. Under the cold gaze of Valyrian overseers, who were often minor sorcerers themselves, the slaves worked until collapse. Magic was used not to alleviate their burden, but to inflict pain, to knit broken bones only so work could continue, and to instill a terror that extinguished any thought of rebellion. And the dangers went beyond exhaustion and cruelty. The mines were a deadly ecosystem. The fireworms, serpentine creatures that moved through molten rock, were a constant threat, capable of emerging from a lava wall to drag the unwary to an incinerated death. Pockets of poisonous gas could be released without warning, filling a tunnel and suffocating dozens of workers in silence. Cave-ins were common, and the life of a slave was considered a negligible price to pay for the extraction of a particularly rich vein of gold or diamonds. Death was not a question of if, but when, and for many, it was a desired liberation. Every ring on the finger of a Dragonlord, every ruby necklace on his wife's neck, every gold coin that paid for his wars and his luxury, was forged from this abyssal misery. Magnificent Valyria floated upon a sea of tears, its divine beauty sustained by the most profane of cruelties. It was in this darkness that a new god was born, not a god of fire or light, but a god of the end. It is whispered that the first faceless man was a slave in these very mines. He heard the prayers of his fellows, praying for salvation, for an end to the pain, and he realized that their gods were silent. So he became the instrument of the only god who answered, the many-faced god, the god of death. He gave the gift first to a slave who begged for it, and then to the masters who caused the suffering. The seeds of the Order of Assassins were sown in the dark, right under the noses of the Dragonlords, a silent judgment growing in the shadows of their greatest achievements. Beyond gold, silver, and jewels, the fire mines of Valyria offered a different type of treasure, a metal that, in the hands of its masters, transformed into one of the greatest marvels and one of the most terrible legacies of the Empire: Valyrian steel. A blade forged with this metal was not just a weapon. It was an artifact, a relic of power, a secret the world would try in vain to unravel for millennia after the fall of its creators. The properties of Valyrian steel were legendary. Compared to the best steel forged by mortal hands, it was incredibly light, allowing a swordsman a speed and fluidity of movement that seemed supernatural. It was stronger, capable of parrying blows from war axes without chipping, and it was said a Valyrian steel sword never lost its edge, remaining as sharp as the day it was forged, even after centuries of use. This appearance was its unmistakable signature. The surface of the metal was dark, almost black, but marked by ripple patterns that danced under the light, like smoke trapped in ice. Each blade possessed a unique pattern, a fingerprint of its magical creation. The secret of its forging was lost forever in the Doom, and that is because it was not a process of mere metallurgy, but a complex ritual that fused craftsmanship, magic, and fire in a way only possible in Valyria. The process began with a master smith, an artisan who possessed profound knowledge of his craft. He took the best iron ore from the mines and initiated a folding process, hammering the metal and folding it over itself not dozens but hundreds of times. This method alone created steel of exceptional quality, but for the Valyrians, it was only the first step, the canvas upon which the true masterpiece would be painted. The second and most spectacular element was fire. The great forges of the city were not fueled by coal or wood. They were built in the depths of the 14 flames, in vast caverns where the earth's heat was omnipresent. And to heat the steel to the necessary melting point, the smiths used the most powerful of instruments, dragonfire. In a dance of courage and control, a Dragonlord would order his mount to release a continuous and controlled stream of flame over the anvil, raising the metal's temperature to a level no mortal forge could reach. The roar of the dragon and the clang of the hammer mingled in a song of creation. The final ingredient, and the most crucial, was magic. The master smith was not just an artisan, but also a spellsinger. As he hammered the glowing steel, he chanted spells in High Valyrian, words of power that were incorporated into the metal structure with every blow. There were enchantments for hardening, for sharpening, for durability. But the darkest legends, whispered by terrified slaves and recorded in forbidden scrolls, insist that the ritual required a final component: blood magic. It is not known for certain if it was the sacrifice of slaves in the forge or the blood of the smith-sorcerer himself, but it was believed this final sacrifice sealed the spells, giving the blade its supernatural resilience and a nearly living bond with its wielder's lineage. Each Valyrian steel sword was, therefore, a family relic, a treasure of inestimable value, receiving revered names like Ice, Longclaw, or Bright Roar. They were the ultimate symbol of a noble house's power, a heritage of fire and blood that could be wielded in the hand. Following the complete annihilation of the Giscari Empire, Valyria established itself as the undisputed dominant force on the continent of Essos. Its colonies spread like wildfire, its legions and dragons guaranteeing the submission of dozens of lesser peoples. For centuries, it seemed no force in the world could challenge its power. But while Valyria was the mistress of fire, another great and ancient civilization prospered under the protection of a different element. These were the Rhoynar, the river people. Their civilization had not been built on volcanoes, but along the banks of the greatest river in the world, the Rhoyne. A river so vast it was called Mother Rhoyne, an artery of life flowing for thousands of kilometers, from its source to the summer sea. Cities like Sarmel, Goyandroh, and the magnificent Croyane, the city of festivals, rose like jewels on its banks, with marble palaces and lush gardens that made even Valyria seem austere in comparison. The culture of the Rhoynar was as different from the Valyrian as water is from fire. They were a largely peaceful people, more concerned with trade, art, and music than conquest. While Valyrians dominated through force and slavery, the Rhoynar governed through a confederation of city-states, each led by a prince or princess, with profound respect for nature and, above all, for Mother Rhoyne, whom they worshipped as their principal deity. But their peaceful nature did not mean they were weak. The Rhoynar possessed their own magic, a water magic as powerful in its domain as Valyrian fire magic. Their water wizards could summon dense fogs to hide their cities, create walls of water to deter armies, and summon whirlpools to sink ships. Their strength lay in defense, in harmony with their element, and they had no desire to expand their territory. Conflict, as always happens between great empires, was inevitable. Valyrian expansion westward placed them on a collision course with the cities of the Rhoyne. Valyrian colonists, with their dragons, founded the city of Volantis at the mouth of the great river, and from there began to push upriver, establishing new outposts and conflicting with Rhoynar city-states over resources and territory. For almost 250 years, a series of minor wars erupted between Valyrian colonies and Rhoynar cities. They were brutal but localized conflicts. The Rhoynar water mages often got the upper hand, using their mastery of the river to frustrate Valyrian legions. But the balance of power shifted when Valyria, the city of dragons itself, decided to intervene directly. The final spark was a conflict with the city of Sarhoy, which was sacked and burned by Valyrians. In response, a charismatic leader emerged among the Rhoynar, Prince Garin of Croyane, who became known as Garin the Great. He traveled from city to city along the river, uniting all the princes in a grand alliance to expel the Valyrians from their lands forever. Garin gathered the largest army Essos had ever seen, with 250,000 men marching under his banner. At first, his campaign was a smashing success. His water wizards summoned the power of the river, creating massive floods that drowned Valyrian garrisons and water walls that crushed their defenses. They retook city after city, and Garin's army seemed invincible. He went so far as to destroy the colony of Volantheris, provoking the direct ire of Valyria. In his arrogance, Garin mocked the Dragonlords, daring them to face him. The Freehold answered the challenge with a force that shook the world. They sent not one, not 10, but 300 dragons to join the battle. What followed was the greatest massacre in the history of Valyrian wars. The sky filled with fire. The water magic of the Rhoynar, so powerful against armies of men, was useless against an enemy attacking from the heavens. The mists they conjured were dissipated by the heat. The walls of water evaporated into clouds of scalding steam. Mother Rhoyne herself began to boil, cooking the fish in her depths and scalding the soldiers trying to take refuge in her waters. Garin's great army was annihilated. The prince was captured alive and taken in a golden cage to Croyane, where he was forced to watch as the Dragonlords enslaved his people, the women and children he had sworn to protect. Legends say that, in his despair, Garin called out to Mother Rhoyne, casting a terrible curse upon his conquerors. That night, a thick and abnormal fog rose from the river, bringing with it a terrible disease that rotted the flesh and maddened the mind. Grayscale. Many of the Valyrian conquerors succumbed, and the stretch of river around the ruins of Croyane became a cursed place, known forever as the Sorrows. The Rhoynar people had been destroyed, but their suffering would leave an eternal scar on the land. With the crushing defeat of Prince Garin and the destruction of Croyane, the Rhoynar civilization was effectively dead. Its army had been turned to ash, its strong men dead or chained, and its cities, once brilliant, were now smoking ruins or occupied by victorious Valyrians. Despair settled over the survivors. For most, the only future was slavery, a destiny perhaps worse than death in the minds of Valyria. But while Garin had chosen to fight head-on and was annihilated, another Rhoynar leader chose a different path, a path not of confrontation, but of survival. Her name was Nymeria, the warrior princess of the city of New York Sar. She saw the futility of continuing the fight. She saw that Dragonfire was a force her people could not defeat. And she made a decision that would become one of the greatest legends of Exodus in history. She decided that if the Rhoynar could no longer live in their homeland, they would find a new home, even if they had to cross the world to do so. Nymeria ordered that all remaining ships along the Rhoyne be gathered. Fishing boats, cargo barges, merchant vessels, war galleys, anything that could float. And then she led her people, mostly women, children, and elderly men, the only ones left after the carnage of war, on a journey into the unknown. The fleet that departed the Rhoyne Delta was a vision of magnificent despair, an entire nation adrift. Chronicles say there were 10,000 ships that followed Nymeria into the summer sea, a number likely exaggerated by poets, but capturing the monumental scale of her undertaking. They had no certain destination, only a guiding principle, far from the shadow of Valyria and its dragons. Their journey was an odyssey of suffering and loss that lasted years. They sailed south, trying to find a safe haven. Their first stop was the Basilisk Isles, a notorious den of pirates. The Rhoynar, weakened and without an army to protect them, became easy prey. They were attacked, their ships looted, and many were captured and sold back into the slavery they tried to flee. Nymeria managed to gather the survivors and fled again to the sea, with her fleet now smaller and her people even more terrified. They sailed east, to the coasts of the savage continent of Sithorios, a land of impenetrable jungles, terrible diseases, and ancient ruins of cursed cities. They tried to settle in an abandoned city called Yin, but the jungle reclaimed them. Giant snakes, diseases that made flesh rot, and a feeling of madness seeming to emanate from the very earth decimated them. After a year, Nymeria abandoned Sithorios, leaving behind countless dead and a part of her people's hope. The fleet then sailed north again, reaching the peaceful Isle of Noth, the Isle of Butterflies. The people of Noth welcomed them with kindness, and for a time, it seemed the Rhoynar had finally found a home. But the island guarded its own terrible secret. A deadly fever, transmitted by the beautiful and apparently harmless butterflies of the island, began to kill her people. The disease was harmless to natives, but fatal to outsiders. With a heavy heart, Nymeria ordered the fleet to depart once more. After years at sea, with her fleet reduced to a fraction of its original size, they finally spotted a new land on the western horizon. It was the coast of Dorne, the southernmost and most arid region of Westeros. It was a land of sand, rock, and scorching sun, but for the Rhoynar, it was a land free from Valyrian influence. There, in Dorne, the destiny of Nymeria and her people would change forever. She found a divided land, governed by a myriad of petty lords and kings. The most powerful among them was Mors Martell, Lord of Sunspear. He saw in the Rhoynar not a band of refugees, but an opportunity. He was impressed by Nymeria's tenacity and saw the advantage her numbers and skills could bring. Nymeria, in turn, saw in Mors an ally with the military strength needed to protect her people. They forged an alliance sealed with marriage. Mors Martell took Nymeria as his wife, and together, they united their peoples. With the combined power of the Martells and the Rhoynar, they conquered and unified the entire realm of Dorne, a feat no Dornish lord had achieved before. To symbolize that her people's journey had finally ended, Nymeria led the Rhoynar to the mouth of the Greenblood River. There, in a ceremony that would become legendary, she ordered all remaining ships dragged onto the beach and set ablaze. The flames rose to the skies for days, a funeral pyre for their past and a beacon for their future. There would be no more flight, no return. Dorne was now their home. Nymeria ruled Dorne for decades, bringing Rhoynar laws and customs, which mingled with the traditions of the first men and undulls. She established equal inheritance, allowing eldest daughters to inherit before younger brothers, a practice unique in Westeros. And so, the great exodus led by the warrior princess came to an end. Valyria, in its quest for total domination, had destroyed a civilization, but unknowingly, had forged the identity of another, creating in Dorne an independent and resilient kingdom that, centuries later, would be the only one in Westeros to successfully resist conquest by other dragons. With the Giscari Empire reduced to dust and the Rhoynar people scattered to the winds, there was no longer any force in the known world that could oppose Valyria. The Freehold entered its golden age, a period of uncontested power, unimaginable wealth, and an arrogance that reached divine proportions. The Dragonlords no longer saw themselves as masters of the world. They believed, mostly, that they were the world itself. To them, all other peoples, the Undulls of Westeros, the inhabitants of the free cities, the Dothraki horse lords, were not rivals or even subjects, but lesser creatures, little more than intelligent animals, existing only for their benefit and entertainment. The city of Valyria itself became a reflection of this mentality. It was a metropolis living in a state of perpetual twilight under the smoke of the 14 flames, a place where reality itself seemed to bend to the will of its masters. The life of the Valyrian elite was a relentless quest for ever greater stimuli, an attempt to stave off the boredom that comes with absolute power. Their banquets were legendary, with delicacies brought from the ends of the world, jade peacocks from the summer isles, wines that glowed with their own light, and dishes so exotic they defied description. But food and drink were only the beginning. They delighted in forms of entertainment increasingly cruel and depraved, often involving their slaves in deadly games for the amusement of their guests. Magic, once a tool for construction and defense, became an instrument of luxury and caprice. Sorcerers were employed to create spectacular illusions at their parties, to sculpt the ice of their drinks into shapes of mythical creatures, or to alter the appearance of a servant to resemble a forgotten god, just to laugh at their confusion. This arrogance manifested most dangerously in their magical practices. Sensing they had completely mastered blood and fire magic, they began to delve into arts even darker and more unstable. Stories and fragments of texts suggest they began practicing chimeromancy, using magic to fuse different species. It is said they created hybrids of humans and animals to serve as guardians or as aberrations for their amusement, men with bulls' heads, women with bat wings. They toyed with the very essence of life, violating laws of nature that wiser peoples knew should not be touched. Their belief in their own superiority, reinforced by the purity of their blood maintained through incestuous marriages, led them to believe they were above consequences. They were the Dragonlords. The rules governing lesser men did not apply to them. The center of their arrogance, however, remained the 14 flames. The volcanoes that gave them dragons and wealth were also a source of geothermal power they exploited with increasing recklessness. Their sorcerers and geomancers dug deeper and deeper, not just in search of ores, but in search of the very heart of the world's fire, believing they could control and channel it for their spells. They viewed the volcanoes not as a force of nature to be respected, but as a personal furnace, a tool to be used and abused at will. They ignored the tremors that became increasingly frequent, the rivers of lava changing course without warning, the strange gases beginning to emanate from new fissures in the earth. They were small signs, warnings that the ground beneath their feet was becoming unstable. But in their ivory tower, built upon the power of their dragons, they had forgotten a fundamental truth. The fire that can be used to forge can also be used to destroy, and the power they believed they had mastered was, silently, preparing to consume them. Amidst the deafening arrogance and golden decadence of Valyria, where most great families were blinded by their own brilliance, a voice of warning emerged from the most unexpected place. It did not come from a powerful archmage or a cautious general, but from a young maiden of one of the less influential houses of the Freehold. Her name was Daenys Targaryen, and she would forever be remembered in history not for her deeds in life, but for what she saw while she slept. She was the daughter of Enar Targaryen, the lord of a noble family, but of relatively minor status. The Targaryens, though pure-blooded and Dragonlords, were never at the center of Valyrian power. They were considered somewhat eccentric, more interested in prophecies and arcane texts than in the political games of their peers. It was perhaps this distance from power that allowed them to hear what others could not. One night, Daenys, still a young girl, had a dream. It was not a common nightmare of monsters or falling, but a prophetic vision, so vivid and terrifying that it marked her forever. She dreamed of fire, a fire that did not come from the skies, spat by their dragons, but a fire rising from the depths of the earth. In her dream, she saw the 14 flames, the backbone of Valyria, not just spewing smoke, but exploding in unison. She saw the earth open in gigantic fissures, swallowing palaces and entire towers. She saw rock melt and the skies fill with ash and smoke so thick the sun disappeared. She saw dragons screaming as they fell from the sky, consumed by the firestorm, and heard the wails of 1,000,000 souls being extinguished in a single instant. She saw the total and absolute ruin of Valyria. She woke screaming, the terror of the vision still burning in her mind. She told her father, Enar, about what she had seen, describing every apocalyptic detail with a clarity that convinced him it was not merely a nightmare, but a warning of the end of their world. In any other family, such a dream from a daughter might have been dismissed as a maiden's fantasy. But the Targaryens had a long history of crediting prophetic dreams. Enar took his daughter's vision seriously. He understood that the catastrophe she described was not a possibility, but a certainty. The question was not if, but when. The vision of Daenys the Dreamer, as she became known, became the catalyst for one of the most drastic and ridiculed decisions in Valyrian history. Enar Targaryen knew he could not convince the other 40 families. They were too invested in their power, too secure in their arrogance to believe their eternal civilization could simply, and trying to convince them would be useless and would only attract more scorn upon his house. So he made a bold and lonely decision. He decided to act based on his daughter's prophecy. He would sell all his properties and holdings in Valyria and the nearby free city of Lys, liquidating his family's fortune. With this wealth, he would move his entire house, his family, his servants, his wealth, and most importantly, his dragons, far from the peninsula, to the farthest and most insignificant outpost of the Empire, a gloomy, volcanic island off the coast of Westeros called Dragonstone. It was a functional fortress, but grim, a place of exile compared to the splendor of Valyria. But it was far enough, Enar hoped, to survive the fire Daenys had seen in her dreams. The destiny of one of the last great Valyrian bloodlines now rested on a father's faith in his daughter's nightmare. Enar Targaryen's decision to abandon Valyria based on his daughter's vision was received not with concern, but with a mixture of contempt and relief by the other Dragonlord families. The news that House Targaryen was selling its properties on the peninsula and in its nearest colonies spread quickly through the halls of power. For the great and proud houses, like the Bellarys and Coheres, who competed fiercely for every inch of influence, the Targaryens' departure was seen as an act of shocking cowardice. They openly mocked Enar, calling him Enar the Exile, a man who had been scared by a girl's nightmare. The idea that their glorious civilization, which had subdued the world and lasted millennia, could simply collapse was, to them, an absurdity so great it bordered on insanity. They viewed the decision not as an act of prudence, but as an admission of weakness, confirmation that the Targaryens were never truly worthy of their place among the Valyrian elite. The sale of Targaryen assets was a bargain for the other houses, who bought their lands and mines for a fraction of their real value, happy to further consolidate their power. Enar didn't care. He sought not profit, but survival. With the wealth he managed to gather, he prepared his migration. It was an exodus on a much smaller scale than Nymeria's, but still a monumental undertaking. Enar gathered his entire household. His children, including Daenys and her brother-husband Gaemon, his distant relatives, his loyal servants, his slaves, and all his transportable treasures, including his library of scrolls and arcane books. And, most crucial of all, he brought his dragons. There were 5 at the time, including the beast that would one day become a legend on a new continent, Valyrian. Although they were not the largest nor the most numerous dragons of Valyria, they were the heritage of his lineage, the living symbol of his blood and the key to his future power. The departure of the Targaryen fleet from the port of Valyria was, without a doubt, a melancholy spectacle. Watched from the high Dragonstone pinnacles by their mocking peers, they sailed west, leaving behind the center of the world, the only home their people had ever known. The journey to Dragonstone was long and dangerous, but they made it with grim determination. Dragonstone was a Valyrian outpost, an insular and volcanic fortress at the entrance to Blackwater Bay, in Westeros. Its location was strategic, allowing the Freehold to control shipping lanes, but it was a gloomy, damp, and isolated place, shaped by strong winds and the smell of sulfur. Its towers were built in the shape of dragons, sinister architecture that seemed more a warning than a celebration. For the Targaryens, accustomed to the splendor and eternal light of Valyria, arriving at Dragonstone must have been like arriving at a tomb. They had traded the beating heart of the world's greatest empire for a lonely rock at the edge of the known map. They had traded the company of self-proclaimed gods for isolation. But, in doing so, they had also traded a certain death sentence for a chance at life. They became the Lords of Dragonstone, a title far less grandiose than Dragonlords of Valyria, but one that soon would become infinitely more valuable. The 12 years that followed the Targaryen exodus were a strange period of silence and waiting. On Dragonstone, life was one of austere isolation. The Targaryens established themselves in their new fortress, their lives now dictated by the rhythm of the tides and the mood of the Westerosi sky, so different from the perpetual twilight of their homeland. They created lairs for their dragons in the smoking caverns of the Dragonmont, the volcanic mountain dominating the island. They maintained a small court, preserving the traditions and language of Valyria, but their world had shrunk from an empire to a single island. Communication with the Freehold was sporadic and mostly hostile. The few messages that arrived were filled with scorn, treating Enar and his family as cowards who had abandoned their post. With each passing year and Valyria remaining standing, more glorious and powerful than ever, Daenys' prophecy seemed more like the foolish fantasy of a girl. Mockery turned into consolidated contempt. House Targaryen was, for all intents and purposes, scratched from the annals of the great families, a shameful footnote in their long history. Meanwhile, in Valyria, arrogance reached its final apex. Without the voice, however small, of Targaryen caution, the remaining families dove even deeper into their dangerous practices. Competition between houses became even fiercer. Archmages and blood sorcerers were hired at exorbitant prices to perform increasingly spectacular feats, in an attempt to outdo their rivals. They expanded their minds recklessly, digging tunnels so deep they claimed to have neared the very heart of the world. Seismic activity on the peninsula increased. Small tremors were now a daily occurrence, but they were ignored as the normal price of living in the cradle of power. The priests of the fire temples performed increasingly audacious rituals, offering mass sacrifices to appease the volcanoes, believing they could control the forces of nature through their blood magic. They were, in truth, feeding the very beast sleeping beneath their feet. On Dragonstone, Daenys the Dreamer lived to see her prophecy unfulfilled for years. It is unknown how those 12 years were for her. Perhaps she herself had begun to doubt her vision, questioning if she hadn't condemned her family to unnecessary exile. Or perhaps, with every piece of news of her former compatriots' growing recklessness, her certainty only strengthened, and she watched the east with a mixture of sadness and dread, knowing the clock was ticking. She married her brother, Daemon, who became the new Lord of Dragonstone after the death of their father, Enar. Together, they had children, continuing the lineage in their new home. Life went on, day after day, a routine of normality built upon the expectation of an apocalypse. The dragons grew. Valyrian, in particular, thrived in the island's volcanic environment, becoming a creature of terrifying size and power. The Targaryens were now a family of Westeros in geography, but still Valyrian in blood and soul, living between two worlds, belonging completely to neither. They were the guardians of a terrible secret, a truth the rest of their people had chosen to ignore, and they waited, 12 long years of silence, of scorn, of a tense calm preceding the most violent of storms. Then, in the 12th year, the final warning came, not as a dream, but as a physical reality that shook the world. The waiting was over. In the 12th year after the Targaryen exodus, the world broke. There was no final warning, no last dream. The end of Valyria was not a whisper, but a deafening scream that echoed across the planet. It all began with a single tremor, but a tremor different from all others the Valyrians had grown accustomed to ignoring. This was not a passing shake. It was a deep, violent spasm of the earth itself, as if a sleeping god were turning in its bed of magma. The ground of the magnificent city of Valyria, made of fused dragonstone, cracked instantly. The impossible towers, which had resisted for millennia, groaned like living creatures in agony. And then it happened. The 14 flames, the chain of volcanoes that had been the source of Valyria's power and wealth, exploded. Not one after another, but all at the same time. It was an eruption on a scale that defied comprehension. Entire mountains were launched into the skies. Columns of smoke, ash, and molten rock rose dozens of kilometers into the atmosphere, blocking the sun and plunging half of Essos into instantaneous and total darkness. A darkness deeper than any night, illuminated only by the infernal glow of the apocalypse unfolding below. The earth opened in colossal fissures, some kilometers wide, and from them poured rivers of lava that did not flow slowly, but advanced like tsunamis of fire, swallowing cities and palaces in seconds. The proud towers of Valyria, which had been sculpted by magic, now broke and crumbled, falling into lakes of molten rock. The mirrored obsidian streets turned into deadly traps, melting beneath the feet of those trying to flee. The sky, once the domain of the Dragonlords, became their tomb. The rain falling was not water, but hot ash, razor-sharp dragon glass, and rocks the size of houses. Dragons in the air were struck by debris or suffocated by poisonous smoke, their leathery wings torn, falling from the skies like burning flies. Those in their nests on the mountain peaks were simply vaporized in the initial explosions. The power that had conquered the world was exterminated in its own home. For the inhabitants of the city, death came in 1,000 terrible ways. Some were incinerated instantly, others crushed by debris, suffocated by ash, or boiled alive by the scalding steam rising from the boiling sea waters. The millions of slaves in the subterranean mines died in their prison of fire. Their suffering finally ended in the most brutal way possible. The catastrophe was not limited to the land. The sea around the Valyrian peninsula began to boil. The water receded and then returned in vapor tsunamis and waves hundreds of meters high, sweeping coastal cities and nearby islands, dragging them to the bottom of the sea. Ships days away were capsized by rogue waves or caught fire when the rain of incandescent ash reached them. In a matter of hours, perhaps less, the greatest and most advanced empire the world had ever known was completely wiped off the map. The Valyrian Peninsula, once the heart of a civilization, was shattered into an archipelago of smoking islands and black rocks. Where once there was a metropolis of impossible beauty, now there was only a sea of fire, smoke, and boiling water. The doom of Valyria was not a battle or a defeat. It was an extinction event, a final, terrible lesson that no power, however great, can place itself above the primordial forces of nature itself. The doom was an event so absolute, so complete, that its true cause remains one of history's greatest mysteries. To the rest of the world, it was simply a natural cataclysm of unprecedented proportions. The maesters of the Citadel mostly hold this view, arguing that the intense geothermal activity of the Valyrian Peninsula, recklessly exploited for millennia, finally reached a breaking point, resulting in a chain reaction of volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. They point to increased seismic activity in the years preceding the doom as proof that the Earth was giving warnings that were arrogantly ignored. In this view, the fall of Valyria was the final price of unchecked magical industrialization, an ecological disaster of epic scale. Nature, abused for too long, simply rebalanced itself in the most violent way possible. However, among whispers in Essos, in forbidden texts, and in the legends of those who lived in the Empire's shadow, other theories, darker and more magical, persist. Many believe the doom was not an accident, but the direct result of the Valyrians' own actions. It is said the Dragonlords, in their quest for ever greater power, delved into sorceries so deep and dangerous they eventually lost control. A popular theory suggests that the archmages and blood sorcerers working in the mines, attempting to contain and channel the power of the 14 flames, committed a catastrophic error. A ritual gone wrong, a containment spell that failed, or perhaps a deliberate attempt to reach a divine level of power that ended up overloading reality itself. In this version, the fire didn't just destroy them. The fire they tried to master broke free and consumed them. It was a magical suicide on a civilizational scale. Another theory, even more sinister, speaks of a secret civil war among the Dragonlord families. It suggests the rivalry between the most powerful houses escalated to such a point that they turned on each other with all their arcane power. Some whisper that a group of sorcerers assassinated the mages maintaining the containment spells of the volcanoes, hoping to eliminate their rivals, but drastically underestimated the consequences. If true, the doom was the final result of arrogance and paranoia, an act of self-destruction born of political greed. There are also those who believe in divine retribution. Followers of R'hllor, the Lord of Light, see the doom as a just punishment for Valyria delving into blood magic and shadow sorcery, offending their god. For the descendants of the Rhoynar, it was Prince Garen's curse finally fulfilling itself in totality, Mother Rhoyne drowning the land of her enemies in fire and ash. Regardless of the cause, the result was the same. Valyria's magic turned against itself. The fire they had used to forge swords and build cities became their funeral pyre. The same energies that elevated them to godhood were what cast them into oblivion. The creatures they had created with their magic, the chimeras and monsters, likely perished along with their masters or were left to wander the cursed ruins. It is almost certain that none of the 40 families who remained in Valyria survived. In a single day, dragon blood, once the most powerful lineage in the world, was almost totally extinct. Thousands of years of knowledge, sorcery, history, and art were lost forever, buried under tons of molten rock and ash. The doom destroyed not just a place. It destroyed a concept, the idea that any mortal power could be absolute and eternal. When the fire finally settled and the earth stopped shaking, the world looked east and saw that Valyria existed no more. Where once stood a great peninsula, the heart of an empire, now there was only a vast inland sea, dotted by an archipelago of black, smoking volcanic islands. The air in the region remained poisonous for centuries, and the waters filling the basin where the city sank never completely cooled. This new body of water became known among sailors and cartographers as the Smoking Sea, and it became one of the most feared and cursed places in the world, a graveyard of nations over which the perpetual shadow of the doom hovered. Stories told by those few brave or foolish enough to sail near its borders were filled with horrors. They spoke of waters boiling for no reason, releasing columns of scalding steam capable of cooking a man on his deck. They reported that the sky above the Smoking Sea was permanently covered by a dense, dark fog, where the sun never penetrated and stars were never seen. Demons, they said, danced in these mists, and sailors could hear their screams in the wind. The islands dotting the sea were nightmare landscapes, with rocks sharp as dragon glass, beaches of black sand, and petrified trees looking like skeletons of a forgotten time. The water itself was oily and dark, and many believed it poisonous to the touch. Sailing into the Smoking Sea was considered suicide. Compasses spun uncontrollably, and maps became useless as the very geography of the region seemed to shift with the tides of smoke. The most disturbing stories, however, spoke of what lived beneath the waves and on the ruined islands. With the fall of their masters, creatures born of Valyrian magic had been released. Reports spoke of colossal krakens dragging ships to the depths, of fireworms swimming in schools beneath the surface, and things even worse, nameless creatures that were merely glimpses of tentacles and multiple eyes in the fog. Some believed the Valyrians themselves had not died completely, but had been transformed by the catastrophe into twisted monsters, stone men whose skin was like cracked rock and whose hearts burned with internal fire, condemned to wander their ruined lands for all eternity. Despite the dangers, the fascination with Valyria's lost wealth attracted expeditions over the centuries. Kings and merchant princes, obsessed with the idea of recovering Valyrian steel swords, spellbooks, or treasures of gold and jewels, sent fleets into the ruins. None ever returned. King Tommen II Lannister of Casterly Rock sailed to Valyria with a great fleet and his house's ancestral sword, Bright Roar, and vanished without a trace. Years later, a single cog from his expedition returned to Westeros, but without sails or crew, just a ghost ship carrying a cargo of corpses and the stench of madness. Jaerion Lannister, centuries later, would attempt the same journey and meet a similar fate. The smoking sea became a barrier, not just physical but psychological. It divided Essos in two, making direct travel from east to west nearly impossible and forcing trade and communication to skirt its dangerous margins. Valyria, which once united the world through its power, now divided it through its death, leaving behind a smoking, cursed reminder that there are places in the world where men should not go. The sudden and total annihilation of Valyria did not bring peace to the world. It unleashed chaos. The head of the serpent had been cut off, but its body continued to writhe violently across the continent of Essos. The collapse of central power created an immense vacuum, and nations and cities that once lived under the yoke or shadow of the empire were thrown into a desperate conflict for power, territory, and survival. This period of generalized anarchy, lasting approximately a century, would become known in history as the Century of Blood. The Daughters of Valyria, the 9 colonies founded along the coast and rivers of Essos, were the first to plunge into war. Cities like Volantis, Lys, Myr, and Tyrosh, once governed by Valyria, now saw themselves as its legitimate heirs. Volantis, the oldest and most powerful of the colonies, was the first to make its move. Declaring itself the new Valyria, its leaders, mostly of Valyrian blood, attempted to impose their rule over the other cities. With their great army and fleet, they initially succeeded, conquering Lys and Myr. For a time, it seemed a new Volantene empire might rise from the ashes of the old. However, the other free cities, fearing Volantene domination, formed a grand alliance against it. Tyrosh and the pirate city of Pentos united, and even the Storm King of Westeros, Argilac Durrandon, joined the fight, leading an army across the sea. The turning point in the war came when the city of Braavos, the bastard daughter of Valyria, founded by fugitive slaves, revealed its true strength and entered the conflict. The war among Valyria's daughters dragged on for decades, weakening them all and ensuring none would ever achieve the power of their mother. While the free cities destroyed themselves, other forces exploited the power vacuum. From the vast plains of the east, known as the Dothraki Sea, came the nomadic horse lords. United under a great leader or khal, they swept across lands once protected by Valyrian legions. Entire kingdoms that had prospered for centuries, like the kingdoms of Sarner and Koth, were completely destroyed, their cities burned, and their peoples enslaved or killed. The Dothraki did not build empires. They consumed civilizations, leaving behind only grass and ruins. In Slaver's Bay, the ancient Giscari cities of Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen, now free from Valyria's economic dominance, saw their slave trade flourish like never before, plunging into a culture of cruelty even greater. The Century of Blood was an era of destruction on a scale rarely seen. The roads Valyrians had built fell into disrepair, laws they imposed were forgotten, and the continent regressed to a state of near-constant warfare. Order and stability, even if tyrannically imposed by Valyria, had vanished, replaced by the law of the strongest. And while the world tore itself apart, on a lonely island to the west, the last Dragonlords watched and waited, guarding their power and planning their next move. While the continent of Essos drowned in the Century of Blood, consumed by the anarchy following the doom, House Targaryen remained in its self-imposed exile on Dragonstone. The scorn and mockery they had suffered from their peers now transformed into bitter irony. The cowards who fled became the sole survivors. The family discarded as a footnote in Valyria's history was now the final and only chapter of its people. They were no longer just the lords of Dragonstone. They were the last Dragonlords in the world. This new reality changed everything. The weight on their shoulders was immense. They were the guardians of a culture, a lineage, and a power that had been nearly completely extinguished. The traditions of Valyria, High Valyrian, history, and above all, the magic of dragon blood, now depended on their small, isolated family to survive. They watched from afar the chaos consuming Essos. They received desperate offers from the free cities, begging for their help in endless wars, offering gold and power in exchange for the use of their dragons. But the Targaryens, led by Enar's descendants, refused all offers. Perhaps they saw the futility of trying to govern the chaos of Essos, or perhaps they were simply focused on their own survival and the preservation of their legacy. Their dragons, 5 when they arrived, continued to breed in the volcanic environment of the Dragonmont, but the power of the lineage seemed to diminish far from the fireheart of Valyria. Some eggs did not hatch, and the dragons born were generally smaller and less formidable than their ancestors. Yet, they were dragons, and the greatest of them, Valyrian, the Black Dread, born in Valyria, continued to grow, becoming a creature of terrifying power, a living relic of a lost world. For almost a century, they remained on their island, looking east, to the past and to ruin. But as generations passed, a new Targaryen leader emerged, a man who began to look not east, but west. His name was Aegon. He was different from his ancestors, who were content to rule their rocky island. Aegon was a dreamer, but his dreams were not of somber prophecies, but of conquest and a new destiny. He looked at the continent of Westeros, a vast and divided land, governed by 7 petty kings constantly at war with one another. He saw a land rich in resources but weak in its disunity, and he possessed something none of those kings had: fire made flesh. With his 2 sister wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, and their 3 dragons, Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes, Aegon Targaryen decided the future of his house lay not in lamenting the empire lost, but in forging a new one. He would leave Dragonstone not as an exile, but as a conqueror, to unite the 7 kingdoms under a single throne. The heritage of Valyria, surviving the doom, would be transplanted to new soil, and the blood of the dragon would rule a new continent. The cycle of fire and power was about to begin again, and so the Song of Valyria ends, not with a note of glory, but with the heavy silence of ash and the echo of a new ambition. History teaches us that even the highest towers, sculpted by magic and arrogance, can be toppled. That absolute power is not an eternal wall, but a gilded cage that blinds us to the storm gathering outside. And that the fire we use to forge our destiny is the same that, if disrespected, can consume us completely. The flame of Valyria was extinguished in the lands of the east, but a single ember survived, carried across the sea, waiting for the right wind, to become the bonfire of a new empire. But that is another story, for another night. Now, let the darkness embrace you. The hearth is fading. The tale has reached its end. Good dreams.